Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gateway Spotlight. I'm your host, Brook Roberts, and we are excited to get started with season 3. We're finally back. It's been it feels like a long summer without having one of these events happening. I'm going to go ahead and formally introduce our guest, and just want to again thank everyone for being here. Our guest today is the one, the only Fanta Aw, the CEO of NAFSA, formerly a president of NAFSA as well. And she has a long and esteemed career working in international education, a long career at American University, and a really interesting international education, sort of international intercultural upbringing, if you will. So we're definitely going to get into that and be talking about the future, what we're looking forward to in international education, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, Fanta. So welcome to the show.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Brooke, and I really look forward to our conversation.
I'm tuning in here in Prague, Czech Republic. I'm traveling around Europe for a few months, just living the dream, living that international education dream. But before we get started with our conversation today, I want to go ahead and thank today's sponsor of the Gateway Spotlight. Without these sponsors, we really couldn't make this show happen. There is a lot that goes into the production of this show behind the scenes, from our producer, Anna, to our assistant ADs and me hosting. And so there is a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. So thank you so much to IDP for sponsoring this episode. If you're not familiar with IDP, they are a global leader in international education with over 50 years experience in building trusted relationships with students, institutions, and the industry. Their forward-thinking use of digital technology, unparalleled live student data, and global network of trusted local counselors allow them to provide insight and ensure success for their students and partners. Through their investments and innovation, IDP has been able to scale and enhance their personal connections, enabling them to deliver global success to more students and partners than ever before. IDP is the strategic partner of choice for institutions around the world who trust their student-first experts in global scale. IDP helps local dreams become realities all over the world. So thank you again, IDP. And because all of you are here and you are friends of Gateway, they are offering you all a 10% discount on any of their digital services. So if you are in the market to work with a company like IDP to help your global reach and scale, definitely follow up with them and just mention that you're a friend of Gateway, and they will extend that discount to you. We have 2 sponsors for this episode. So we're really lucky to also have the Spanish Institute sponsoring. Again, if you're not familiar, the Spanish Institute has been offering high quality programming in Sevilla, Spain to learners of all ages for 40 years. They are recognized by the Cervantes Institute in Spain as an accredited center, a hallmark of quality, affording practical advantages to the Institute on behalf of their students. Additionally, they have a partnership with a U.S. School of Record with the University of Montana. For university students, the standard study abroad programs include robust logistical support and instructional travel throughout Andalusia, I'm not sure how to say that, as well as hosting custom faculty-led programs at any time of the year. They also have standard summer intensives and semester programs, as well as a la carte Spanish language and culture programs. So thank you so much to both IDP and the Spanish Institute for sponsoring this episode. And so we're going to jump right in to a conversation with Fanta. And as we go through this conversation, please drop any of your comments, questions, and your own thoughts about anything we discussed today. And we will happily bring that into the conversation during the sort of Q&A audience participation portion of the show. So okay, Fanta. I've listened to several interviews preparing for this conversation, so I feel like I know your story very well. I could be your hype woman at this point. But I would love for you to tell us sort of the origins of your international education journey and how you found. I guess tell us that first sort of meaningful intercultural experience that you remember having in your life, and how that sparked sort of the rest of your curiosity in this world.
Again, thank you, Brooke. It's great to be here with Gateway, and I really look forward to our conversation. I would say that probably the first significant moment where I understood the value of an intercultural education was probably when I was about 8 or 9. Happened to have been at the time in Liberia, West Africa. Had left my home country of Mali and had gone to Liberia because of my father's profession, and was attending the French International School in Monrovia. And I remember distinctly forging a really kinship and friendship with a student at the time from Norway. And our families got to know each other very well, got to learn a lot about Norway in a way that I knew nothing about Norway. And as I reflected on that, the school was incredibly international with students from literally all over. I remember friends from Lebanon, from Norway, from France, from Germany, from throughout different parts of Africa. And what I appreciated was the fact that here we were having a shared experience, and here we were from very different parts of the world. It helped me to understand and appreciate the value of difference, but it also, more importantly, helped me to understand the value of our commonality. And that was probably my first, I would say, sort of experience in thinking about international and intercultural education. And then the journey continued from that point on, I would say. But definitely, I would say 8 or 9 in my formative years, that was the first encounter with the notion of international and intercultural education.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I'm curious, in the structure and design of the program and curriculum. I mean, I know you were 8 or 9, maybe you're not even sure at this stage, but I'm curious if the fact that they had this global, intercultural, diverse student body, did they utilize that as a tool within the curriculum, in the projects and programming that they put together for the students? Was that an integral part of the experience, or was it more of a sort of, we all do the same thing, we're going to kind of ignore the difference?
Great question. And I would say that it was also the time that I understood that even though I was in a setting that was incredibly international and intercultural, that the curriculum did not necessarily reflect that. And the curriculum had a very dominant paradigm. And that paradigm was the French educational system, right? So going through the educational system, it was also my foray in understanding how different educational systems have their dominant knowledge paradigm, and that does not necessarily is always inclusive. And so we learned about the world, but we learned about the world through the lens of
the
French.
Yeah.
That was very evident. And so I would say the intercultural learning happened in between classes. It was at recess when we were, for example, having our meals, and each of us would have a different dish, for example, and beginning to ask ourselves questions about, it's interesting that we all eat rice, but we eat rice in 5 or 6 different forms, right? Through those conversations that it would happen during what I would call, coming together at different parties in each other's homes, where again, we would see the artifacts that families would have on display. We would hear the stories that they would tell us about their lives and their countries and their cultures. So the learning really, in this instance, took place outside of the classroom. And that also reminded me that, in fact, when we think about how learning takes place, it takes place in all different spaces and places.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's also just a nice reminder too, where we're all thinking about how do we program these experiences and how do we design them. And I'm an advocate of that, like intentional design of a program, but at the same time, leaving space for that cognitive dissonance for the student to go and sort of figuratively stumble their way through an experience and messing up and saying the wrong thing. And, having that moment of, oh, this couldn't have been planned for, couldn't have been designed that way. Yeah. And I think that's beautiful, beautiful experience. So I know you went from Mali to Liberia, then to Kenya for a bit. And I encourage everyone to go Google her name, there's plenty of other podcast interviews where she dives deeper into some of these things. So I wanted to kind of give a fresher perspective on some of this. But tell us a little bit about that when you got to American University. Do you remember any kind of initial thoughts, feelings that you had that first arrival or I guess I should ask, was that your first time to the United States, and what was that like for you?
Again, great question. After leaving Liberia, I actually came to Washington,
Oh,
um,
okay.
in Maryland, and I went to the French school in Bethesda.
Oh,
Then made it to Kenya and graduated from the French school in Nairobi, and then spent a gap semester in Rwanda because by then my parents had moved to
right.
Rwanda, and then made my way back to Washington and to American University. And my first, so I am what I think many people would consider a typical global nomad, and in this case, third culture adults.
Yeah.
We feel at home everywhere and at home nowhere.
Right.
I think that is the hallmark of the global nomad experience. And so when I came to American University, I have to say I felt at home,
Mm,
and I felt at home on a lot of levels. It was incredibly global, an institution. The size of the institution really allowed me to feel like I could navigate the institution easily. And I found myself again in a circle of friends and a circle of environment that was familiar yet very different.
mm,
Because here I was now, navigating a completely different curriculum in a language that was not a first language, or in this case, a second language in English. And what I remember distinctly were a couple of things. Um, the the nuances of language, you know, Brooke, just something as simple as in the American sort of vernacular, see you around. I
yes.
did not really understand what see you around actually really meant.
Yes.
There were so many of those moments. And yet coming into a culture, you don't always feel comfortable asking those questions
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to come across as you're not aware, particularly when you're 18, 19, right? So you have those to contend with. And so among us as international students, we often used to talk about, the culture shock that takes
Mm-hmm.
place when you come in. You remember going to the grocery store, and here you're looking for milk. There's
Mm-hmm.
2% milk. There is, half and half. There is whole milk. There's so many of those. And you keep asking yourself, wow, this is quite interesting. Different environment, different culture, different ways of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so your ability to know how to navigate that, and frankly, what you also get as a result of that is really the value of cultural humility. And I
Mm-hmm.
talk a lot about the importance of cultural humility. And that is accepting the fact that we don't know it all, nor are we expected to. And we have to be willing to readily admit that, you know what, I don't know, and be willing to ask the questions and
Mm-hmm.
seek the answers from others.
Mm-hmm. I could totally relate to that experience of the grocery store and just seeing the strangeness. I grew up in Kansas, sort of like stereotypical rural experience. And when I studied abroad in Geneva, Switzerland, I recall, I grew up around animals and farms and,
Yes.
that whole environment. When I went to the grocery store and I went to go buy my milk, I was just shocked that none of it was in the fridge, the
Yes.
cooler. And I was like, what is happening with the milk situation? Didn't did I had no idea what was going on. I just thought, did somebody mess up? Are they trying to,
Yes.
get everybody sick? I remember calling my mom, a couple weeks later, because back then it was like calling cards and
Yes,
got her.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's the
And
calling card, right?
yeah,
This was the
yeah. And I was
common
like,
thing
I
on
only have
WhatsApp.
5 minutes, but I have to tell you about the milk situation.
Yes.
And obviously,
Yes.
I eventually understood, they just process it differently. And so
Yes.
it's just a different requirement. But also, on a, that's a very surface level experience. But as I grew up and learned more about the world and even about the US and our own farming, industry, I learned a lot more about how we
Yes.
make our food and milk and how that's
Yes.
different and why things might be better in some instances than not. And it just helped open up. But that moment of, I remember standing there going, what is happening? So
Yeah,
I love that
absolutely.
story.
And
Well,
and you
I
use the
go ahead.
word you use the word cognitive dissonance earlier on.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's an incredibly important part of what an intercultural experience needs to have, right?
Mm,
The notion of cognitive dissonance is really important because that's where serendipity also happens. And that is also how I think students who navigate an intercultural and international education really in many ways also develop the level of resilience that is needed.
mm-hmm. Absolutely. 100%. I always joke around. when I was advising students, I would tell them, hey, if you don't cry at least twice, you did it wrong. Because it was too easy. You didn't like push
Yes,
outside of that comfort
yes,
zone
yes,
just enough. So I obviously say it's silly, and I
yes,
don't want
yeah,
students to feel left alone and in crisis, but at the same
yes,
time, there's like that moment, as you
yes.
know. So I could, reminisce and swap stories with you. I would love to do that. Maybe next NAFSA we can have some time together. But let's talk more about our field, international
Sure.
education, your work at NAFSA, because I'm fascinated to see how I think it's been what, about 6-7 months since you've been at the helm. Is that correct? Okay. And
Yesterday
so
made it exactly. Yesterday was my sixth
okay.
month. So
All
yes,
right. Yeah. So you're kind of at that moment of like, oh,
yeah,
did I do the right thing?
yeah,
Oh, those early growing pains in any
yeah.
new role. But yeah, I guess tell me a little bit about how has your first 6 months been as CEO of NAFSA? Is it everything you thought it would be? Has there been any big surprises?
Well, I was just reflecting on that yesterday, given that it was the 6 months milestone. And the way I would describe it, Brooke, is that it's been invigorating. It's been challenging in really good ways, and it is the best decision that I made in a post-COVID world.
Hmm.
And for a myriad of reasons. I often say to people, I've come back to NAFSA, a place that is familiar yet different. Because I often say I've grown up professionally with NAFSA, and NAFSA has always been part of my intercultural and international education journey. However, I also left the field for a period of time to engage in other areas of work for about 6 years. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
coming to an organization that I'm not going to pretend I know as well anymore, because we've changed, the world has changed, the field has
Mm,
changed. And so that's the lens from which I look at my work, and the lens from which I look at coming back to NAFSA. But it's
mm,
been incredibly invigorating. Part of what drew me to NAFSA at this time is that it is a membership driven organization. The ability to co create with members is incredibly exciting to me. And
mm,
that's been the history and the legacy of an organization like NAFSA, this
mm,
ability to co create with our members.
mm,
And there's something to be said about having member leaders who are so fired up by the mission of the field, and who show up every single time with great ideas, great insight, but more importantly than anything else, I would say energy that is contagious. There's something to
mm,
be said about that. And that is what fuels me, frankly, on an everyday basis, is engaging with members, engaging with member leaders, engaging with different strategic partners, learning from them and learning together.
mm.
So yes, I would say it's been invigorating. It's been challenging, but I'm so glad to be here at this time. And I'm so glad to be on this journey with so many.
Yeah. I mean, after listening to a few of your interviews, I just kept thinking, wow, it's really amazing and lucky, I think, for us as a field and as a member of the field to have someone who's so positive at the helm, and is sort of a glass half full. At least that's what you come across for sure.
Yeah,
But because I think that there are so many challenges, it could be an easy thing to go home at
yeah,
night and just feel defeated, like what there's nothing to be done, because we know
yeah,
there's been a lot of things coming down the pike or have come down the pike that directly impact our work and or kind of fly in the face of all the
yes,
progress that we've made. So I really
absolutely.
appreciate your positive perspective and can do attitude on that. So with that, I'm curious if you could summarize for all of us to get familiar with, if you were to summarize, what are the strategic goals or plans that you and the NAFSA team and NAFSA leadership, the membership leadership, all those people have sort of decided these are our core priorities over the next year, 3 years, because obviously this 5,000 things you could focus on, but what have
Sure,
you decided are the core things that are most important over the near term?
sure, sure. I would say there are a couple of things that are strategic and of importance to us. And they've come about because in listening to members, but also seeing the state of the field, it became evident that those needs to be things that we remain focused on, and that it really does needs to be front and center of mind. And I would say a couple of things. On the public policy side, our public policy work is in the US environment. We do not, with hubris and with humility, are not interested in getting into public policy having to do with other countries. We have no business telling other countries how to run their things. So I want to be clear that our focus on public policy is US centric, and it's US centric strategically for that reason. One, because we believe that in the US environment, international education exists in a larger ecosystem. And the kind of environment that we have and the role of geopolitics absolutely has implications for international education, it has implications for mobility, it has implications for strategic directions that we take and so forth. So public policy is front and center of mind. And specifically, our focus is really on pushing for a national strategy on international education for the United States. So that's one priority area. And we can talk more about that later on. Second priority for me is understanding the state of the field. Part of our social responsibility as a field is to ensure that we have a robust and vibrant pipeline for future generations of leaders in international education. And I want to ensure that NAFSA is an important player in how do we prepare the next generation of international education leaders. And that is a priority for us. We said that the field has changed. We've also said that, our environment as a whole has changed. Our ability to secure the next generation that will be as fired up about this work is incredibly important. And we cannot take that for granted. That's the second piece that I would say is important. The third piece is for NAFSA, at the end of the day, what is key for us is the professional development of our members. And part of that professional development is understanding that the environment is constantly in ebb and flow. How we provide and arm our professionals with the tools that they need to be the most effective in their institutions and beyond, and to feel like they have the support that they need to really thrive in their work is incredibly important. So I would say the area of professional development, learning is incredibly important. And then lastly is leveraging our convening power. As an organization, if we're able to bring people together and have a seat at a table where we can engage in substantive, hard questions and conversations about the state of the field, that would be an incredibly important part of the work that we need to do. Ultimately, all of what I've talked about, whether it's the public policy, is securing the next generation of leaders for the field, it is the professional development and the tools that we provide, the convening and all of that, that has to be anchored in a mission. And that mission is we want to see a better world. We believe that international education is a vehicle to a better world and a better society for all. And I think we cannot lose sight of our critical mission, and that has to be front and center, because the why of our work has to always be the center of why we continue to do the work that we do.
Yeah, I have like 17 follow-up questions about all of that. Yeah, I think I definitely want to talk about the policy initiatives, but before we jump into that, I definitely want to talk about this concept of the pipeline of new talent or new leadership in talent, but also then supporting existing professionals who are, already in the field and in the roles and doing the work. I think, if I understand correctly, you, before coming back to NAFSA, you were working still in higher ed, but in like student life, student affairs side, correct? Okay. So
Yes.
you still have your, you understand higher ed in general. And I think, we've had in higher education, higher education, massive amounts of brain drain from professionals who've spent their entire careers in education focused and dedicated to this field. And I'm just curious, I feel like this bridges maybe some of the policy, but maybe not. But like the advocacy for NAFSA, like where is the role of NAFSA in helping institutions figure out how to retain top talent, how they don't lose to the tech startups that will essentially, double salaries and really compensate people for the value that they bring to the organization, or offer flex or remote work and all these new things that are even more valuable to people. Have you seen or had conversations around this idea of the brain drain of our field, specifically international ed, and what NAFSA's role is in retaining that talent?
It's a very valid question. And Brooke, yes, having spent 30 years in higher education, And much of that time was spent in looking at student success and outcome, as well as looking at enrollment. But as part of that, I had also a pretty sizable team where I was responsible for a sizable team. And so we have all read about the Great Resignation. We certainly have also read about the challenges related to the future of work and how, different organizations and entities have to really flex and adapt and so forth. So this is absolutely real, and it is a real challenge for higher education. But it is also a challenge for many other sectors as well, correct? So
Oh, yeah.
here's I have two thoughts about this. One, in some ways, I have seen folks leave higher education to go into other sectors. And a part of me has also been of the mindset, seeing the glass always half full, has also been of the mindset of, you know what, if we can get more of people with that orientation and that thinking in other sectors, that can only benefit us writ large. Because the ability to have more folks, for example, in the tech sector with an orientation to international education is more likely than to have that tech sector pivot to some of the needs that we know exist and is needed in international education. So I'm not necessarily seeing that as a zero sum. I'm actually seeing that as a potential win-win. Now, with that said, we cannot afford in higher education to have the exodus, the mass exodus that is needed, because we need as many folks as we can within the field. And that requires, as you mentioned, a couple of things. It required a mind shift, and it required creating intentional incentives. So among the things that we, for example, at NAFSA felt was important was we needed to map the competencies that are needed in our field. And in mapping those competencies, ensuring that our members and others, as they take the professional development, sort of offerings that we had, that we could map those to competencies. Because the more we can explain and help our members understand that the nature of our work is deep and wide, and that the breadth is such, then that hopefully energizes them to begin to think in more substantive ways about the breadth of the field. And I was just yesterday talking to a group of SIT master students, because one of the things I get the most joy from is talking to people who are a part of that pipeline. And they ask that exact question. And to me, it comes in multiple forms. The future of work requires that flexibility. It requires for institutions to understand the value proposition that we bring to it. But it also requires then that those institutions who are not willing to, in many ways, be innovative, they're going to lose out to others. So for NAFSA, part of our work is ensuring that our members understand that there's choice, that they understand the value proposition of their work, and that they understand the growth opportunity within their work. We hope that that will help people reimagine their roles within higher education, and will be in many ways inspired enough by that to see their why in education. But if that doesn't work and they find themselves in the ed sector, or they find themselves in the private sector, like many have gone into, that is a win for us. Because what it says to me, Brooke, is we have more allies now in areas that we didn't have before. And we need as many allies in many sectors as we can get.
I love that perspective, the glass half full perspective for sure. Anecdotally, I can say I work for Podium Education, which we're within Pan International Higher Education for sure. But it's not like study abroad director like I used to be, for instance. But I was having a conversation with somebody not anywhere near higher ed or international ed, and basically explaining what happens in an intercultural experience and why that's valuable and why it can be valuable to an employer. And they were like, wow, no one's ever explained that way before. That is super important. We're going to definitely look at, the talent pipeline when they say, hey, I studied abroad or what have you, or I'm an international student, that I think about that differently now. And I'm like, oh, wow. Like, I thought everybody knew this because obviously we're all in a bubble. We think everyone understands the value of these skills and these experiences. So I think that's great. I do want to press on this a little bit more. And it was a question I already had, and Marty Tillman and I are having a mind meld here, but he asked in the chat here about specifically the challenges faced by NAFSA as an organization, not in terms of serving the field, but as an operational organization. I know your team also shrunk quite a bit as a result of the pandemic. I know they weren't your team at the time necessarily, but how are you facing as a leader of a team that has some really big goals and aspirations and priorities with much fewer resources? How do you see yourselves delivering at the level that NAFSA has always been expected to deliver, but with much fewer people to make that happen?
No, thank you for asking that question. And again, coming from a university to now NAFSA, what Marty and you are describing is not unique to associations. We're seeing it in
Mm-hmm.
higher education, right? I mean, higher education, we're seeing some of the retrenchment that happened as a result of COVID. We're seeing a reimagination that's taking place along the field. And so, in specifically as it relates to NAFSA, yes, during the pandemic, because the conference was an important venue for us, and during the pandemic, all organizations that had conferences had to suspend that. NAFSA
Mm-hmm.
had to make some decisions prior to me arriving, and it did lead to a retrenchment of staffing by about a third of the staffing. So that is certainly is a real challenge that we confront, and is a real challenge that I'm coming into as we speak. With that being the challenge, and also celebrating our 75th anniversary, Brooke, one of the things that I've always had to learn is how you become resourceful.
Mm.
The notion of resourcefulness is something that I've always had to navigate. One is I've always been in organizations where there's never been enough resources to do what you need to do. I mean, just period. Let's start with that. Second, in knowing that there's never enough resources to do what you need to do, you need to focus on what you're going to focus on. And it therefore means that there's some things that you have to be willing to let go of and not try to be all things to all people. I think that's important. And I don't think that we're always willing to really stretch ourselves in that way. That's number one. Second is you don't go at it alone. In coming into NAFSA, you've heard many of my interviews, and one of the things that I've talked about is the value and the importance of strategic partnership.
Mm-hmm.
There are many, many people who are engaged in the field of international education, with NAFSA among them.
Mm-hmm.
The more we can partner, and the more we're stronger together. So that's the second thing, is the value of strategic partnership. The third element is we need to leverage the opportunities that have opened themselves up to us. And we have to ask ourselves different questions. One is, what is the role of technology as an enabler in today's world? Those are things that we're going to have to figure out and to be able to work through as examples. Lastly, one of the things that has always been the strength of NAFSA team has not done all of those things that we've talked about as a team alone. We've always had to co-create with members. And we have members who are willing to continue to co-create with us. The more we can leverage what I call the brain trust of what exists within the field, the more then we're able to advance some of the strategic areas of the field. So for where I sit, this is not a time when you go at it alone. This is a time when you go at it with others. This is also a time when you refocus and you reimagine the state of the field and where you're trying to go. So yes, very challenging. There is no doubt that it is a challenging time, and we have to work with the resources that we have. But it is also the fact that for an organization that's existed for 75 years, we need to be able to leverage the strength of what 75 years has garnered. But we also need to understand that we as an organization will have to continue to evolve.
So to go a little deeper on this, because I love tangible, meaty stuff. You mentioned that, you're gonna have to let go of something that previously was maybe part of the larger NAFSA umbrella of service and efforts. Is there anything specific that you see NAFSA kind of releasing, maybe in partnership with another organization, where you say, "Hey, we're gonna let them be great at that and support that," or some other type of thing that you see NAFSA letting go of?
I think it's a very fair question. And what I will say, Brooke, is being into it 6 months, I am still learning the different parts of the work.
Fair.
So this is really about how I do a full audit of where we are and what we're working on. And in doing so, also really engage different stakeholders. So I would say it is still premature in things that come immediately to mind of things I would let go of. So just as an example, on the public policy, before I arrived, the public policy team had a lot of different agenda items. They, to their credit, has really synthesized the 3 or 4 areas that they're going to engage with. and really try to get some wins from. That's an example of one of those areas of saying, you know what, there's all of these things that we could be doing in public policy, but what is our why really, and where can we have the most impact? That's an example. But if you 6 months into it, I am still on that journey of understanding the breadth and depth of what we're engaged with, and then determining where we really are better off partnering, where we're better off just letting go because there are entities that do it much better. And what we do then in that case, Brooke, for the sake of the field, we uplift that. Because that's the other thing that I think is important from where I sit. We need to be able to provide our members and the field the whole breadth of what is available. And that means also uplifting the work that's happening in other areas and saying, hey, you know what? These folks are doing really interesting work in this space. Let's make sure people are aware of it, because we want to be able to provide as much of a holistic picture of the field and where it's going. That's a bit of what's happening. Here's an example of something that I can say to you that is concrete enough. So research is one example, right? I believe that is not our strength. And I believe that that's an area, for example, that I would say we probably would want to let go of. In letting go of, we understand the role of research in us making, the value proposition of some things. We understand the role of research in lots of different ways. But you know what we would do in that case, Brooke? We would go to the organizations that are really, really good at research. And what we want to do is partner with them so that jointly we can have a joint sort of venture in that area and collectively make the case for some of the public policy work. That would be a concrete example of something that I would say I wouldn't want to see NAFSA build that research infrastructure, because there are others who do it much better than we do.
Yeah, good. I love that. So, I want to be mindful of time. I really appreciate your candor and openness to having this conversation. It's challenging time. It's not all
Yes.
roses and sunshine. So
Yes.
I really appreciate your honesty and you being forthright on all of that. I did want to talk about the policy initiative, though, sort of as a wrap up, and we'll dive into some questions that have started to come in. So please, if you have been holding on to any questions, those of you in the audience, please add them into the Q&A box or in the chat, whatever's easiest for you. And we'd love to address those with the rest of our time. But I'm curious, if you were to choose, one policy initiative that we could talk about some of the nuances of, because I know there's probably, like you said, there's many, but prioritized. What's like the number one policy initiative on your desk, right on the NAFSA desk, we'll say right now, specifically?
There are many, as you can imagine, but
Yeah,
I will go with one that is probably more front and center. And it's the policy and regulatory pieces around visas, right? And visa issuance. NAFSA has had a very strong and long-term relationship with the Department of State. And as a result of those relationships, we have seen advances in, for example, ensuring that international students are at the front of the queue in visa issuance, because it's important for our institutions to be able to have students get here on time and so forth. We've seen some of the work that has evolved around dual intent. We've facilitated those things, along with students being able to have their visas issues, 365 days before the beginning of the semester and all of that. Those are things that really, through joint partnerships, have been instrumental as we have facilitated the mobility, for example, of students. As we work through those issues, one of the things that I think we want to pay attention to is coming out of COVID, there's pent-up demand from students and international students around the world in wanting to make their way to, to the United States. And we're hearing from members and from member colleagues about some of the challenges of visa issuance in specific parts of the world. And it is no secret that for me, one of the key elements of international education is diversity and inclusion. We want to see as many students from different parts of the world be represented in our educational system, the same way we want to see students who reflect America go abroad. So as we hear about the visa denials and the visa issuance challenges, that is front and center of mind. Because as you can imagine, students put their hopes and dreams in being able to, after going through a very rigorous process of getting their applications in, going through so many hoops. This is the last sort of, threshold to meet before you kind of get here. And so to see that that there's challenges there, and that we're seeing in specific regions of the world, specifically in this instance in the global South, is something that we care about. And it's something that we want to be in partnership with the Department of State and in partnership with others like the President's Alliance and others in really making sure that we can do better in that area of work. It would be one example of of a policy issue that to me is important. Tied to that also is it's not enough to get students here. We've got to figure out pathways post completion. Again, there we've had some wins with optional practical training, having 36 months for those who are in the STEM field. And most recently, the fact that the STEM field, the number of sort of disciplines has continued to increase through advocacy is incredibly important. We need to think about and figure out what are pathways post completion to green cards and others, because what we want to be able to do, Brooke, is provide choice to students. It doesn't mean that all students want to come and stay in the United States. It doesn't mean that all students who come want to stay indefinitely in the US. But it is incredibly important that in coming and based on what learning they've acquired and knowledge they've acquired, if they wish to contribute for a period of time, we want them to have that option. That's another policy agenda that's really important to us. And again, we are not in it alone. We're in it with coalitions. And that's an important part of how we're thinking about some of our public policy work.
Well, it's interesting that you, I think the visa work, I know there's a lot of nuance and specifics that change over time, but it's kind of been a consistent policy initiative in a lot of ways. But have you seen the movie Oppenheimer yet?
I have not. I've heard I've heard
Okay.
great things from so many people
Well,
that it has really intrigued me.
I mean, it's an interesting. It's obviously it's a amazing movie, a film. But in terms of, I remember I went out with friends after to have a drink, and we were talking about it. And I basically got on my international ed soapbox and I said, do you see, like, all of that was possible because of international education? Like, I know back then it didn't have the, all the structures that we have now today, but essentially, the exchange of ideas and students literally moving around the world. I mean, we could argue about the outcome of what they created together. That's a different conversation, but that was a mind meld of brains and brilliant people from all over the globe, essentially, coming together to work on a project. And I said, that's international education. And they were okay, be quiet, Brooke. We don't, but I just thought, yes, this is like a poster child for what the work that we do, essentially. So definitely go watch that as soon as you have a moment. I will. 3 hours, you need 3 hours. But
I've been told it's a long movie, but it's one that is worth seeing. So
yes,
it's definitely on my list. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to turn it over to our audience and ask any questions that y'all have had. I'm going to jump into the Q&A. But again, if you have any questions that I didn't get to that you're just dying to hear from Fanta, please add them to the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll dive in. So we have a question here. It's anonymous. So it says, hi, Dr. Aw. I'm so happy to hear from you and your vision. You spoke about professional development for the field. Can you talk about how DEIB will be a focus of this professional development? I ask because I often get the sense from many professionals, a white savior complex and a lack of cultural intelligence.
Thank you for that question. And also, most importantly, thank you for having the courage to state this. So a couple of things come to mind. Just yesterday, we held a town hall on the SCOTUS decision, the ban, the DEI bans, and international education and the implications for international education. This will be part of many conversations, but more than conversation, this will be more about how we raise consciousness and how we, in many ways, provide people with both the knowledge, the skills, and the ability to know how to navigate these things. The field has to, in many ways, reflect what the world looks like. And so what that means is not only who we are bringing into the field, but then how, as a result of who we're bringing into the field is changing accordingly. So you're hearing and you're getting a lot of discussions that are taking place, Brooke and others, about decolonization of the curriculum. You're hearing a big movement taking place about indigenization, and what that means and what that looks like. The issue of belonging is a huge one that is taking place. And you have heard me say before that part of the work that we need to do that is both embedded in the professional development And it is part of the NAFSA competencies. When we develop the NAFSA competencies, DEI is anchored in those competencies. And that was intentional on our part because we wanted to make sure that there were not sort of bifurcated discussions that were taking place with international education here and DEI there. I've always argued that they're absolutely one and the same, and they must be integrated. And we must have a holistic approach to how we talk about this. Because there is not one approach to international education, there's not one approach to internationalization, and therefore how we equipped our members, how we equip people in the profession to have both a consciousness but a mind shift is incredibly important. So you will see more and more of our offerings integrating these, and it will be very visible in the way in which it's integrated. That is the first and most important thing. The second thing is who we bring to the table. We mentioned earlier on the importance of intentionality. It doesn't just happen. You have to be incredibly intentional about what voices you bring to the table. And it's not enough to bring voices to the table. The question is then, how do they get heard? And is it then reflected in the work that we do? So you've heard me talk about who we bring to the table. And in some cases, we're going to need different tables. That is specifically because the piece of DEIB is absolutely integral to our field. And this is not only for the professionals, it is also for all parts of the work that we do. Whether it's student mobility, the question is who's engaged in student mobility, who's engaged in international education, and who is left out. And what are the equity issues that we must confront in our field? And in that sense, yes, it's not all rosy, and we have a lot of work to do to really get to the place of much more inclusion and equity. And I'm not naive to think that that's going to happen in a day or in a year, but it will not change until we force the envelope for that kind of change. And I have to be honest, it's this generation that's going to hold us honest to that. Yeah. Coming from a university setting where I was working with students on an everyday basis, much of the change that happened around some of these topics were students demanding that change. And I see the same thing with our field. I see this generation asking for new paradigms for how we think about this work and how we do this work. We have work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, we have a little bit more time here, but our audience is quite shy. I think, they're just very intimidated by us, I think. No, but I think that was a great answer. I think that one of the areas I'm very keyed into, which is a reason I actually joined Podium, is I've worked in education abroad my entire career. And the challenge of turning the dial on just the broad number of students who get to participate in some form of mobility-based international experience is just, we've been doing a lot of work from financing to program model changes and shifts. I mean, we've done a lot to expand it. And I don't want to dismiss any of that labor that I was actually part of too, but it would still just feel so like, what can we be doing? And I'm curious, where maybe do you personally or where do you see NAFSA engaging in the world of digital experiences or COIL or virtual exchange or the many names that we have for it? It's still so new and fresh. We haven't really come to terms with like what all of this is truly called. But does NAFSA have a position on how we expand that access to these meaningful intercultural encounters and learning that might have to be delivered in a different modality? And does NAFSA see a role for them to help facilitate or encourage that?
Again, really important question. And you had asked earlier, how does NAFSA see its role and how do we see ourselves in the future? This is a great example of where partnership becomes important, right? COIL continues to really, in many ways, expand. And I have to tell you, there are institutions and entities that are doing incredibly important work in that space of COIL. Whether it's the Stevens Institute that is looking at virtual exchanges, and what we can learn from that, and where NAFSA and others can be important partners in it, is getting a state of the field. So they're, for example, right now working on a survey, and we're pushing out the survey because we actually want to make sure that the breadth of the field is engaging in that. The more we all know about the state of the field and where it's going, the more we can learn from it and we can iterate and we can expand, right? So that's an example. So my position on digital learning is, there's been a lot of debates over a period of time about how with study abroad, it must be and it can only be physically going abroad.
Mm-hmm.
My attitude on a lot of things is we have to plant the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And planting the seeds starts in all different ways. If we can get students to start and to engage in more virtual exchanges, the better for all of us. If, as a result of virtual exchanges, it incentivize them and inspire them to now go into physical sort of mobility, then you know what? We have gotten one step further. There are so many students who, as a result of their own lived experiences, and as a result of so many things, are not always have the privilege of physically going overseas. We have to be willing, and we can be creative about this. There's many who are trying to do this, is figure out what are the alternatives. So there's a lot of conversation about internationalization at home. There's a lot of conversations about the role of digital. And so our ability to be open to those ideas and to see how those are incredibly important tools and how we integrate those within the larger frame of how we think about the education abroad is incredibly important. You also have entities like the Forum on Education Abroad that are really key in the kind of conversations and things that are happening. So NAFSA for us is not replicating what is happening, but how can we elevate those?
Mm-hmm.
Brooke, is one of the things that I see the role of NAFSA is the thought partnership in this endeavor. And so for me, if you ask me, what do I see NAFSA doing is if we can find out more about the state of the field through, for example, the Stevens Institute, then we can make sure that we're getting that thought leadership out to as many of the institutions that we work with and as many of our members so that they can learn from each other. And in doing so, that facilitation will be an important part of it. Do I see NAFSA entering the space of, for example, digital, sort of, and COIL? Probably not in the near future. But is it important for us to elevate that? Is it important for us to amplify that? Absolutely. Let's figure out who are the strategic partners who are doing an exceptional job in that. And let's make sure that our members have access to that information.
Great, great. We're now getting questions. The gauntlet has been laid down, so we're getting some questions coming in here. So, how does NAFSA see itself supporting refugee students on U.S. campuses?
Here's a great question, and it goes back to the question was asked: what are your challenges, and what do you see, and what's happening? We cannot be all things to all people. Refugee students, the President's Alliance is doing an exceptional job. The most recent initiative that has taken place on how to welcome refugee students and how university can host refugee students, NAFSA has signed on to that. But NAFSA is not a primary driver on refugee students. We are primarily focused on students who are coming in under student visas and others, understanding and recognizing that we have partners who are doing an exceptional job and who are doing a much better job in that space.
What is an organization that focuses on the sort of the refugee student population? I'm just curious myself.
So it's a great question, Brooke. What I will say is that the President's Alliance, for example, the President's Alliance on Immigration has really taken that on and has taken the mantle in that space, and they've done a lot of work in that space. You're also seeing IIE, the Institute for International Education, has really also doubled down in that area and has been a champion of taking a look at that as well. There's been a coalition that has come together to really work to ensure that universities are hosting refugee students and are creating sort of the environment for refugee students. NAFSA has signed on to that. So those are some of the entities that I would say are focused specifically on refugee students.
Great. So we had another question come in, and it's very specific again. So they say, can you share any new info since NAFSA's brief? And then the title is The United States Needs a Coordinated National Strategy for International Education. And I think their question is, how will NAFSA update its membership on these details?
Thank you for that question. What I can share is the national strategy, as I mentioned, is one of our priority focus. We're right now in the process of being part of a coalition that is looking at, including thinking of what campaigns could be around this specific area of work. We are planning this fall to have a briefing that would be virtual briefing In addition, we provide updates on the work that's happening through our Connect Our World. That's the place. That's the sort of the digital sort of network that we use to give updates on what is some of our policy updates and everything else. And then lastly, any new developments that would be taking place that we feel is newsworthy would be putting that into the NAFSA news. But we know that in addition to putting those out, we do want to hold a briefing that would be a virtual briefing for members and others so that we can update them specifically on where we're seeing some progress and where we can also really use their advocacy work to help us with this. So more to come this fall.
Right. Yeah, we have a couple more questions, but we're running out of time. And I always like to end this on a slightly lighter note. So we're going to answer one more question. Thank you all so much for submitting these. For you, Fanta, thank you so much for being here and answering all of these questions you were not primed for necessarily. So this question is regarding Chinese students. And so they say, are you concerned that the rapid decline in Chinese students and governmental concerns about espionage will reduce Chinese university partnerships with NAFSA and U.S. universities in the near term? What is NAFSA's position in this issue?
Thank you for that question. Let me first start by saying I'm deeply saddened by what I see as sort of the ramp up of rhetoric around China, and in some cases, some of the vilification that I think we're seeing. This is not unfamiliar. We've seen this happen in other settings, and this is detrimental on a lot of levels, because part of what we value as international educators is the people-to-people exchange. We believe that people-to-people exchange is absolutely instrumental to the work that we do and to really, frankly, creating a better world. And so, yes, I am concerned, but more than concerned, I'm also really deeply saddened by some of what I'm seeing. With that said, what is NAFSA doing? I can't go into all of the details because some of it, for lots of different reasons, are still in the works. But here's what I can say. We have kept the door open, and we will always keep the door open with our Chinese partners. And they were very present at the NAFSA conference, and they will continue to be present at our conferences, because they, like us, understand that in moments like this, where our governments may be, back and forth with each other, where change happens is people to people. That is the first and most important part. Second, we will continue to speak out on the importance of welcoming our Chinese students and our Chinese scholars, because it is incredibly important for geopolitics, but more than that, it is incredibly important for what we as international educators value. So do I see declining in numbers? Yes, because anytime you have this kind of climate, it is only understandable that students and parents start to ask themselves bigger questions, because they seek, and rightfully they should, a welcoming environment, and they need to ensure that their students in coming to the United States will have that kind of welcoming environment. And right now, it is not a welcoming environment. So we will continue to speak out in the ways that we can, and we ask others to speak out as well, because we are not part of government. As entities, this is what we can bring to the table.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that this is something about a membership organization or any type of organization you're a part of. I mean, obviously you need to, vote literally, when there's something that you can vote for or against, and then also be an active member. If there's something you're incredibly passionate about and knowledgeable about, and you have a special set of skills, as they say, that you can bring to the table to support any particular policy issue or other thing that we've talked about, like raise your hand and step forward and be part of the solution that they find to some of these challenges. So I encourage everybody to be, to join in the fight with NAFSA as they work with the members to make all of this happen. So thank you so much again, Fanta. I have one final question. Hopefully it's a nice, light, fun question for you. So I started off with, we talked about your first sort of meaningful intercultural experience. I'm curious, I think as international educators, we should be constantly trying to put ourselves back in those first time shoes of being uncomfortable, feeling that cognitive dissonance, and just the hand sweaty, palm sweaty situations. where do you see yourself having your next meaningful intercultural experience? What's your next bucket list place that you want to go get uncomfortable in?
Great question. I will be headed to Pakistan and to Iraq.
Interesting.
Um,
Oh, so
and
where in Iraq? I'm curious, where in Iraq? Are you going to the
in
Kurdistan
back
region or?
in Baghdad.
Okay,
So
wow.
I will be heading there. And there's two reasons for it. One is that I've been invited, and there's really an opportunity to learn about that part of the world that is
Hmm.
not yet familiar to me. I've certainly been to the Middle East, and I've been to other parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. But this will be my first time in both Pakistan and in Iraq. And the intercultural experiences that I will have the fortune of experiencing, I think will be incredibly humbling.
Mm.
And I very much look forward to that.
Yeah.
The other reason why, to me, this is important, these are parts of the world where US engagement has been less than stellar. The ability to go and see it for myself and hear it from those who are in those communities and societies, and to hear it firsthand is incredibly important. Their everyday lives and experiences matter, and it deserves to be heard. And so having the ability to be able to spend some time and to hear it from that perspective, I think is incredibly important for us as international educators. So I'm going to those two places, Brooke, because I will be an eternal student.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely head to the local market. And next time I see you, I want to hear about the milk.
Absolutely.
So awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fanta. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone, for being here live and participating and asking your questions and providing your own commentary. This has been a pleasure. So thank you so much, Fanta.
And thank you, Brooke, and thank you to Gateway. It's really been
Yeah.
an honor. And it's been wonderful to be able to spend time with all of you. Continue the important work.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to the Spanish Institute and IDP for hosting this, sponsoring this episode, our inaugural episode of season 3. I also want to shout out sort of the things we have coming for Gateway. We're going to be doing monthly episodes of the show moving forward. And we have these all themed out throughout the year. So if you head to our website and the spotlight page, you'll see the different topics we're going to be discussing and unpacking over the next 9 months or so. So definitely be looking forward to that. And we have a lot of new things coming up with Gateway. And so I'm going to ask Anna to drop the link to our newsletter. If you're not on our newsletter, please sign up. That's where you're going to get the most up-to-date information as well as the recording to this episode into your inbox. So definitely sign up for that. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And we will see you next month.